So I'm going to begin with a question for the last story that I was commenting on, which was um, barbecue. What do you think that title means after reading the story? I would have the same question for this story since we have something that seems to be Spanish. Is it Mericans? That's the title of the story, and the story will finish precisely with that word, right? Which is repeated, I see, three times. Mericans, Mericans, Mericans. One adjective that caught my attention was the adjective awful to apply to the grandmother of the story. It repeats several times, and the story actually begins right that way. We're waiting for the awful grandmother who is inside dropping pesos into la ofrenda box before the altar to la divina providencia. So perhaps I should help you out by saying that the location of this church is not in the United States. If you don't understand that the location of the church, then the story will not make sense to you. Secondly, it's possible today, as far as I know, to find perhaps in Chicago, where the writer was born, Cisneros, an image of the uh, Virgen de Guadalupe, right? The major patrona, the Virgin of Mexico, La Virgen de Guadalupe. So it could be possible that people one day, for a celebration, would go and stay close to that image that was brought over from Mexico in recent years. But at the time, for these stories, I don't think that would prove right. Okay, truthful. So historically truthful. So no, the kids were taken to Mexico on a trip, right, to visit their grandmother, and it is three siblings. It's the narrator, it's and two boys, right, and they are playing outside of the church as her grandmother is inside praying, right? I thought that one could take this activity of praying as, of course, part of Catholicism and the religious practices in Mexico, in Latin America, and also here in the States nowadays, being that the Mexican American community is so prominent, so large, so important. Um, but one has to say also that not everybody praying and going to church would be for the family and for the culture, maybe as important as abuelita, abuela, grandma. And as you see, the role that she plays is crucial if you start paying attention to what she does at church, right? It says, for instance, that in the first page of the story, that she's praying for Uncle Fat Face, the blackest of the black sheep. Always remember your Uncle Fat Face in your prayers. And that's the voice of Abuelita, right? Telling them, remember him, because he's always doing something that can get him in trouble. But then we also find out as we read the story that the grandmother, right? It's also praying for everybody who matters to the family. For instance, on page 19, it says, I count the awful grandmother's mustache hairs while she prays for Uncle Old, sick from the worm, and Auntie Cuca, suffering from a life of troubles that left half her face crooked and the other half sad. So I don't think it's the same as the role of the mother. The role of the grandmother here is keeping the whole family in connection to the, you know, to God, to the divinity, and therefore, without this, um, without this person in the family, the connection goes away, right? So uh, the child or the narrator is telling us that this grandmother is awful, right? Awful to her. But this awfulness is the result of the children being obligated, required to go to church along with the grandma, right? And then finding no purpose on doing that. Although, and she forces Micaela even, right, to go inside and pray along with her. And on page 19 again, um, the child is so perceptive again that she knows that when she says what in English to the grandmother, the grandmother finds that very disrespectful. The child should be addressing her grandmother in Spanish, right? So page 19 reads, what? What? I say, though it is neither proper nor polite, what? Which the awful grandmother hears as what, right? What? Which means that the linguistic connection, right, between grandmother and children may be complicated by the languages they speak. The grandma doesn't speak English, and so the children will need to switch codes. And I have the inkling that the narrator knows that she is being a bit mischievous, to say the least, when she replies to the grandmother in English. She knows that she can go que in Spanish instead of what, right? Que. But she doesn't do it because she feels forced, right, to be there, and she wants to contest that requirement. Um, at the same time, by narrating the whole story and by describing what the grandmother is doing, she is providing us with an entrance to the significant role that the grandmother plays for the family, and how religiosity can be so vital for the suffering of this community. Um, we have in a previous story, remember that sentence about driving to the border? Well, here we have the children and the family on the other side of the border in Mexico. So this back and forth between Mexico and the United States is part of the reality of many Mexican Americans in the United States, and it's been the reality of those living in the border towns, right? There was almost, and there hasn't been much of a border. If you talk to people in El Paso, right, they would say, we are all mixed. We are all together here, right? Mexicans and Mexican Americans. They may know their differences, but at the same time, they treasure each other within the community, right? So the story speaks to that reality, the reality of being back and forth between the two countries. And that's key, I would say, for the title of the story.